Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our GIBS Flash Forum on a very, very chilly Thursday morning. It's my privilege and pleasure to be hosting Musa Kalenga this morning, who's going to be turning on his camera in just a moment to be joining us, to be having a conversation, mainly around his book, Ladders and Trampolines. But we're going to be talking about a few things because the book's a wide-spanning book. So welcome, Musa. It's fantastic to have you here this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Lovely to see you this morning.
It's good to see you too. And I was asking Musa to describe himself in 4 words just now, and I loved his answer because he said, for today, he's a freezing African digital ninja. But I said, Musa, I'm not going to do a long introduction, although I certainly could do a long introduction. I think what's incredible about Musa's career is the way that he's navigated so successfully across entrepreneurial domains from the time he was very young, starting at school, into very successful corporate positions across Nedbank and across Facebook, back into entrepreneurship. And what shows through all the time is somebody who has really managed to navigate change so well, which is something that we all need to do. So Musa, I wanted to sort of start with the book because I'd like to focus on it. And clearly there was also a lot going on in your life at the time. Now, I produced a book last year, and these things don't just pop out for half an hour a day. It really is a labor of love. So what made you decide to write the book then and there?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There was a hell of a lot going on, but what had happened preceding the book is that I'd been collecting kind of stories and anecdotes. As you go through life, one of the ways I express myself is I write, and up until that point, I never really thought about it being a book. I just thought I'd kind of collect some thoughts. And I did that fairly diligently with the intention not necessarily ever being to publish, but just to kind of document my thinking. And I was very fortunate at that time. I was working for Facebook, and I was spending a lot of time between South, East, and West Africa. And on one particular visit, we were supposed to be in Ghana for about a week. And there was a whole, what I used to call the circus was coming from the US with, Sheryl Sandberg and everybody. And I was with Nunu at the time. And after everything kind of subsided, Nunu and I actually took a drive out to Elmina Castle. And that's where, for the first time, I was confronted with what slavery actually meant over the years. And it was an amazing tour where they took us into places where, they documented the specifics of how slavery had happened and transpired. And I found that documentation process very interesting because once again, the whole adage around, if you don't tell your own story, someone will tell it for you, for me became quite real. And so on the drive back, actually, from Elmina Castle, I was quite depressed, needless to say. But at the same time, I realized it was an important opportunity for me to take some of those thoughts and actually convert them into a book of sorts. And I just had a child as well. So I had this young baby I brought into the world, and a big part of me was wanting to almost bridge that gap from my own experience, having being blessed to have an African father who's alive, but having struggled to make kind of the generational connect, right? So to be able to understand, what did he go through? I mean, my dad had a phenomenal life. He was a race car driver, and then he was a playwright, and then he was all these things, and I just never felt like I had understanding of that world, right? I never felt that I had a direct line into that world. So kind of it was the generation kind of passing on to me to kind of say, well, would that be the same scenario for my children, which I thought would be very unfortunate. So a big part of the process was documenting it. So they had a reference point around my life, well, at least until that point. And then I kind of got this really, really huge urge to try and start understanding how I start to share my kind of journey as short as it is, or, as
well, you've packed a lot into it.
I thought it would just be good to start somewhere,
No, I thought it was this really interesting weave of, on the one hand, some very, very sage advice on how to survive as an entrepreneur with our work identities, but at the same time also being really insightful around what it means to be African, about where we come from, about where we're going. And in fact, I mean, one of the things that really strikes me across the book is this theme of momentum. And I absolutely love the title. So this question of ladders and trampoline in a world where we're speaking about exponential and linear and non-linear and all of that sort of thing. Tell me a little bit about just the metaphor and how you've applied it, whether it's in the book, whether it's in other spaces, because I think it's this really potent thing. And there are obviously risks to climbing ladders and to bouncing on trampolines.
Absolutely. And the one thing I did realize that throughout my life, some of the decisions I was making, I was kind of doing as second nature, right? There was not really a reference point or a framework. I wasn't quite sure about what the output would be, but I'd make the decision and I'd kind of live with the consequence. And I realized that, there's actually a better way to think about decisions in a very practical sense. And hence the thought around a ladder and a trampoline. And in particular for young Africans who are placed in scenarios where they'll either be the first at what they're doing, they'll either be the only person, they'll probably be in a very lonely space, if they're endeavoring to do anything impactful. And so the theory behind a ladder and a trampoline really is about understanding how you displace energy and what the outcome is of that energy being displaced. And so ladder decisions effectively are incremental. And there's a lot of value in understanding incremental decisions, because if you talk about diligence, if you talk about applying yourself, that often becomes a very incremental process. Waking up and just doing the thing every single day consistently to become a master of what you do really is a process of ladder decisions. And those ladder decisions tend to take a long period of time to achieve big impact, but when they do, it kind of changes everything forever. And then you have, the trampoline decisions with potentially the same energy. You can apply a trampoline decision and have exponential outcome or exponential growth. In my own life, I think about it. When I joined Nedbank as the group head of digital marketing, and I was in my early 20s, a lot of people would say you'd need to have about 15 or 10 years under your belt to be in that particular position. But for me, that was a trampoline decision. I was coming out of entrepreneurship. It was just the intersection of me knowing what to do and having the skill and someone believing in the opportunity. And for me, that was, very much taking me from a place where I didn't have to go through the ladder steps to get to that point. So being able to recognize it is equally important, but the theory really is about how you get incremental outputs versus, exponential outputs. And that's literally just a license to be able to think and dream bigger when you have to.
So I guess a lot of people would also say, though, that the opportunity around digital marketing in itself is something to trampoline. With very limited spend and the right kind of efforts and the right kind of focus, you can really amplify your brand, your offering. So I'm going to switch a little bit into the business space, and then I'll come back to some of the bigger space that we find ourselves in. And you give, I thought, some really great advice to entrepreneurs who may be desperately, particularly now, under the economic conditions we face, trying to grow their markets, awareness of their brands, forge audience connections or connections with their target markets. And I'm going to ask you there to recap. And let's assume, I know we're speaking to young Africans, and one can assume that there's a level of digital savviness around that. But I think not everybody who starts their own business necessarily feels that they have the knowledge on how to grow their brand in the digital space and create the revenue. So we'd love some advice on that.
Absolutely. I think the interesting thing about the opportunity is a lot of people don't realize the extent to which they can actually participate meaningfully in really, really impactful marketing. One of the big frustrations I had, even when I was at Facebook, and ironically, I think yesterday Facebook released an SMB study, which is small medium business study. So they released a global report around the state of small medium businesses, which had been long coming. So when I was still there, I was always fascinated by going to different countries and interacting with entrepreneurs, startups, small businesses who were literally doing very well without understanding how they could exponentially get benefit from a platform like a Google or like a Facebook. And so I used to spend a lot of time with them understanding what they needed to learn and understand to be able to get hold of that opportunity. And the first thing was just the psychology of platforms and social platforms. There's a bit of a distance between your average entrepreneur and a Facebook or a Google. There's an unspoken, it's that thing, and then there's my business. There isn't an understanding that they integrate. And it was very weird because when I started first speaking about Facebook to small businesses, they thought it was just the place where you post things, you like and you share, and it's that place. And then obviously all of a sudden, it's got 1 billion people that are on the platform, and it's got phenomenal volumes in relating to people coming back every day. And then it shifts from just being that place where you go and like and share to actually being an audience generating opportunity. So the first thing is that psychological shift, that they're just not, these social platforms, they're now media platforms. The second thing is the process around getting value really is there's no other way, but it's a systemized failure process, right? You're gonna boost a set of ads, and they may not work and they may work, but you'll learn something. You're gonna try another format where you actually build a an audience or a population, and you see how they respond to ads. So this appetite to be able to test and learn is also not necessarily organic to an entrepreneur. One, because you don't have the time, and two, because the little money that you do have has to deliver very quickly, right? You're obviously in a place where you don't have unlimited budgets. But every single success story around adopting these platforms has been, 50 Rand ad spend today, and let's see what happens. 100 Rand next week, let's see what happens. And so your confidence builds over time, but your confidence is being based off the data you're getting from the platform. So you're seeing, oh, I'm reaching X amount of people, and wow, they're actually engaging, or, they clicked on the ad. So there's a nice way that you can reciprocate the small spend that you have with data that gives you insight on what you're doing. And so that confidence, that momentum leads you to start understanding the fact that once you've been able to build up some audience, you can then also do what advertisers and marketers have been doing for many years, is buying big audiences using what they call reach and frequency. So once you've boosted a number of times and you've been able to get 100 or 1,000 people to follow your page, the major opportunity is then you can start to fish in the big wide world, right? So you're not only then speaking to your 1,000 followers or your 1,000 fans, you can build a campaign to speak to people in Italy, in Uzbekistan, and wherever they may be, and you provided your product and your service is global, you really are then playing on a global market. So really it's this incremental understanding of how you get to that point, but I've seen it happen. I've seen small businesses literally, one of the ones that used to blow my mind was a young lady in Nairobi. And she used to go and buy clothes in the US, in the UK, and she used to come back, advertise them on WhatsApp, do her client service management on WhatsApp, advertise them on LinkedIn, and do the audience marketing on Facebook. And that was her entire business. And she went from spending, like, at the time it was like $15 a month to like almost $5,000 to $6,000 a month, which is phenomenal. And that's just ad spend. So you can just imagine what she was getting in terms of revenue.
In revenue, yeah. So, but the thing is just to make that first leap and move away from this just being posting to mates and actually thinking about it. And then what I'm hearing is just keep learning, which is what entrepreneurs do all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, one of the things I was reflecting on as you were talking about Facebook launching their findings, Jack Dorsey at Twitter didn't have such a good day yesterday with major hacks of people like President Obama and Bill Gates, etc. Yeah. And this is one side that with digital and social media is there are phenomenal opportunities to amplify brands. But at the same time, it seems, and I'm not asking you here for entrepreneurs, but generally, it does seem that in digital marketing and social marketing, that there are risks that we maybe need to be aware of that are growing. And what's your sense of what we should be looking out for there?
Yeah, well, I think that the first and the biggest risk is that your audience or whoever you're trying to reach is probably a lot smarter and more savvy than you are. That's the first biggest risk, right? So what that means is that we often take advantage of the people that we actually speaking to as marketers, and we don't actually respect them. And when I say respect them, it's as simple as saying when you're constructing communication or an ad, you have to be able to speak to people in a way that allows them to reflect themselves in your messaging and in your brand building efforts. If you don't do that, often you're going to find yourself being extremely irrelevant, and then technology becomes your enemy. The second thing is that a lot of these audiences, especially the younger ones, generation, I'm still kind of millennial, but if you look at Generation Z and Alpha generation, those guys are on another level when it comes to understanding how this technology works. You probably would have seen what recently happened with the Trump campaign, where Trump launched an online campaign, and he wanted to launch an app, and Generation Z and the beta generation effectively all went to these platforms. Number one, they started uploading really negative reviews in the app stores. So they effectively drove down the credibility. The second thing is they all started literally spamming the president of the United States, because they knew the power of content generation and moving in unison to be able to achieve a goal. So please
God, they also walk and vote. They need to vote as well.
Exactly. Let's hope they fulfill on that, right? But that level of understanding, I would probably put it, is probably higher than the average marketer in terms of knowing what you need to do to be able to drive a movement, right? So if that's the kind of person you're communicating to, that means that you really have to step up your efforts and make sure that you're respectful in the way you go about speaking to them. We have this big challenge in the African context, of the age-old, dancing commercials with, that being the only thing that connects to, African consumers. And so a big part of that is just, not being able to understand and getting the insights to be able to drive really powerful creative. So I think you're right. I think it's really important for us to know that there's the underbelly. But once again, we have to empower ourselves. We have to start learning and understanding how these things work to be able to avoid those risks.
And I guess also if you have an organization with a sense of purpose that people buy into, you'll buy yourself a little bit of forgiveness, but you've got to be authentic, as you say, with these, younger, very digital savvy consumers. If you come across as being hypocritical in any way, there we go. Sogren's pulling us the Trump things. Sogren, you slow, hey, today. I mean, if you were truly this generation, you would have had it up. Okay, Sogren's going. So, Musa, I'm going to move, and of course, maybe that's why Trump doesn't like TikTok as well, because it's the TikTok teens. I'm gonna move into the domain of corporates, and one of the things that struck me is when I was reading the book, the first thing must have been this transition from running your own business into going to work for. Look, Facebook may be different, and Nedbank was going through a major change at that point. But if we look at the world of marketing in corporates, it can be pretty staid, can be pretty stuck. Maybe some of the current circumstances are leading us to become unstuck. I'm interested now in assuming that we have members of our audience who also might be working in marketing in corporate. And I should have said earlier, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to post them on the Zoom webinar chat. That's the one that's easy for me. Just post a comment or put a question up there if you'd like to. If we're thinking about, marketing departments and how they've had to change, I mean, it really was interesting when digital and social first started, and perhaps this was some of your experience. It was like this little piece, and then there were these huge, traditional above the line marketing departments. But if marketing departments and marketing is to be increasingly relevant, and I think really here, marketing has to trampoline. It cannot climb ladders. What's your advice to people who are working in marketing and also their agencies, this marketing network, to actually trampoline into the way that marketing needs to be going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid observation. And my view is that kind of marketing, for me anyway, it's kind of come full circle. When I first started studying, my intention was to move into actuarial science, actually. So I was intending to become quite technical and mathematical about my approach. But this tension I have between my left brain and right brain didn't quite allow me. But what has happened is that it's come full circle. I believe that the trampoline that is marketing is that marketers need to start appreciating and understanding the more quantitative components to being able to understand the impact of the marketing function. I think for the longest time, unfortunately, marketing started getting renegated to the space where you're effectively just about, golf days and then CI and fancy colors and the gifts and that kind of thing. And I think marketers allowed that to happen over a long period of time. But the big opportunity now is that marketing has to start repositioning itself to start driving conversations. The simple reality is that consumers are still consumers and consumers are still people. And the best placed people to understand people are marketers in the context of business. In South Africa, I think the gift and the curse of the way the economy is set up is that it's run by a lot of chartered accountants, very numerical people. And they tend to bring a lot of other numerical people around the table to be able to solve for problems, even creative problems. And so marketers have to start understanding what that means, the analysis that goes into making decisions, the impact that you measure from a business perspective, et cetera, to regain, I think, their seat at the table. And the second thing is that's not to the sacrifice of creativity, because often people say it's kind of, it's ones and zeros, and it's not. It's just being able to speak in a very different language to be able to understand what drives commerce, but being able to use the creative principles that were always the thing that created excitement, brand engagement, the love, to be able to validate that. Because in the world that we're in now, the data is absolutely available. In the world that we're in now, the information is absolutely available. So there really isn't much of an excuse as to why we can't make that trampoline, as you've said. And I just think it's about a change in mindset. And I think younger marketers, although they're more intuitive to kind of the digital reality, have to develop that muscle from an early stage. Because the other risk with a lot of information and a lot of data is that you kind of don't know where to start. It just becomes a whole bunch of information and it means nothing. And so the ability to glean insights, to glean strategy really become where I think marketers can start to have an amazing opportunity in the corporate context.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I was also just thinking this sort of partnership between finance, between the CAs. I think it's actually a huge relief for finance in a sense that they are now where marketing was seen as we're investing and, all of these famous quotes about 50% works. We don't know which 50%. You really can see now. So part of it is even, I guess, what I take from what you're saying is that even if a marketer feels that inherently they're not quantitative, this opportunity to form a partnership with
Yeah.
the investment arm of the organization and be able to show those results and educate them on that. Because I think often, in my experience, the finance are sort of, marketing is seen, and marketers have liked it that way, as this mysterious black box where you can't possibly get a view into the box.
Yeah.
So we've got some work to do in our organizations. You know, we've spoken about business, we've spoken about small business, large business. I want to move now to a part of your identity that shines through the book, and that is as a passionate African who wants to see the continent take the place that it deserves, get the attention that it deserves on the global stage, and also be able to come proudly with an African identity. And I mean, one of the curses, obviously, of our country, but also of our continent, is around inequality, is around poverty, the legacies that we face. And of course, on one hand, I always say in this Zoom world, you and I and our audience today are all in the same space, as different as our circumstances may be. But it goes without saying that for the 50-odd people who are here right now, from an access perspective, when it comes to digital, there are millions of Africans who can't access this. And to me, if we're going to trampoline well-being for the continent, we have to change that digital divide. Now, you know far more about this than I do. You've been operating in these spaces of people who are spanners, organizations like Facebook who are trying to span this. But what's your sense? And I would imagine that a lot of this has to be to policymakers across the continent. What's your read on how things are changing and what needs to change more?
Yeah, I think, you know, exactly to your point, you know, the speed and the rate at which the consumer is requiring change is definitely out of kilter with the rate of change that is actually happening. And a big part of that, if you think about how you connect people and how you create value, is for people to have the benefit of the internet and technology. They need to be connected, and they need to have access to the hardware. There's major efforts now that have been stepped up as a result of COVID-19, where I think, you know, governments have started to realize that this thing is not kind of the next generation. It's kind of what needs to happen now. And so I see there's a bit more urgency. But if we don't have that gap closed, it becomes really quite an academic discussion around how we use technology to change people's lives. It goes without saying that if you add that component to anybody, whether they're living in rural Lusaka, Zambia, or whether they're living in Johannesburg, there's a level of equalization that you bring, which very few other technologies have ever been able to do in the history of time, right? So access to opportunity, access to information, the democratization of knowledge, all of that is as a result of being able to provide connectivity and then the technology that it connects to. So I've really struggled to look around and find any other way that we're going to be able to, at even a minimum, try and kind of bring those levels of competition to the same point. And for as long as we don't have that as our ambition, it's going to be always unequal. It's always going to be imbalanced. So the clarion call, really, as you've put it, is for the government, the policymakers, the people who have to accelerate this kind of thing, to take very seriously the impact of not doing it on human life. We're actually creating exponential gaps between not only income classes, but across generations if we don't do it. I think the stats were released by the World Health Organization, or is it WEF, that spoke about, I think, for every 10 or 20 kilometers of infrastructure laid down, there was a notable improvement in the surrounding communities in terms of access to opportunity, et cetera, excuse me, which makes absolute sense. And so for me, I think being African and being an African living in Africa and having had the privilege of traveling around the world, I see the definite difference in the Africans that have been exposed to technology, and not only just connectivity, just technology as a whole, when it starts to being able to put them in a ball with other, you know, young people from across the world. There's one young man I'll reference, his name is Sisakelo Dlamini. Amazing. He's an engineer, he's from Swaziland. And he's been playing with technology since he was in his early teens. He now is going to be an analyst for one of the big United States firms. And he was saying to me when he went there for his initial initiation and orientation, and he was now with the guys from Singapore, from China, from the US, from all over the world, he felt that there was a level of equalization to a certain extent, because there wasn't any blind spots he felt he had in relation to the people that he was with. And the only reason why that was the case is that because he had access and connectivity to the internet, right? And he comes from Swaziland, which, you know, is not the biggest metropolitan in the continent.
Sure.
But he felt that because he's been connected for such a long time, he could actually compete on the same level. And then the second thing around economic freedom is just the belief in self-value. I actually was having this debate last night on one of the WhatsApp groups I'm part of, and they were like, well, you know, what does economic freedom look like? Like, tell us what, you know, where's the picture? Show us the model. And for me, I was like, well, let's look at the step before economic freedom, right? Let's talk about what it's going to take to get everybody to the point where they believe in the value that they have and they believe in contributing to creating new value, right? That's the starting point. If you can start there, then economic freedom becomes a byproduct of that. But that notion around getting young people to believe in their own value and believe in the principle of value creation is something which I think we're lagging quite far behind. You know, without going into the challenges with our education system, I don't think we have, you know, enough systemized ways we're putting young people into environments where they can figure that out earlier. You know, entrepreneurship is but one of the ways. And I always say, you know, not everybody's an entrepreneur, but the sooner you give yourself the opportunity to try it, the better. Because if you figure it out early enough, we get lots of benefit for you as a content. If you don't figure it out and you're only, you know, 40, 30 years old, when you realize, actually, I'm an entrepreneur, you've lost all this time where you could have employed, you could have been creating value, you could have been doing all these things. So I think the sooner we start with all of that, the easier it'll be for us to program this notion around value creation and appreciation of value from a self-belief perspective. And that, for me, I think is the core challenge as Africans as we approach technology.
But you've segued so beautifully, because I wanted to actually move to personal branding and your reference to education, and you speak about it quite a bit in the text. You know, from a personal perspective, I felt like my schooling education system was this constant scorecard of where I was in making the grade, as opposed to these are your strengths. So there was this constant deficit model, and there are, you know, we can have multiple criticisms around education and our schooling education. And when we start thinking about, for example, what it takes to stand out, what it takes, and that's not about standing out to put other people down. I think it's far more about the lift as you rise. You can't lift if you don't rise yourself. So this question of building a personal brand, being able to have the world, to ensure that the world discovers you. I mean, you've done a remarkable job both in the digital space. You've been able to transcend typical brand boundaries. I mean, we've all often been sort of told, well, if your product is that, you're putting yourself into a box. I don't think anybody ever boxes Musa Kalenga. So, you know, you may have done this subconsciously. Maybe you had more confidence because of the travels. I don't know what it was, but you know, as somebody who works with individuals to try and make sure that they succeed, and both you and I have that in common. What's your advice to people in terms of building the personal brand? And I'm not talking here about get a Facebook account. I'm talking about this genuine, the kind of learnings you've had in getting to the place that you've got to.
Yeah, you know, it was such a long, funny enough, it was such a long mental process to start making peace with the fact that, number one, it was okay to go about the process of building a brand. That was a personal brand. It felt very unnatural as a starting point. I'm contrary to popular belief, I'm quite a shy individual, and I don't necessarily like the spotlight. I don't necessarily like to just be out there for the sake of being out there. And the long journey for me was actually, if you're presenting yourself in a genuine way, if everything that you're saying is completely aligned to what you're doing, then it actually doesn't really matter. And so the challenge most of the time is that when people think about brand building, they think about the aspect of celebrity and not the aspect of being celebrated. And it is something that Tebe Kalafeng taught me, which I'm forever grateful for, is that if you spend a lot of time on your craft and you get really good at what you do, number one, you will have a higher chance of being celebrated. But not everybody that is great at what they do is famous, and not everybody that is famous is great at what they do. And so to make sure that you're clear about being true to the fact that when you wake up in the morning, everything that you do is aligned to what you want to do. And then if the fame and if the celebrity, if the brand building comes as a consequence, that's great because it'll be off the right base. If it doesn't come, that's also great because you're doing what you need to do. So I think the starting point really is a real reflective process. It's actually sitting down and going, what am I here to do? What is my role on this planet? What do I think I'm going to contribute? And to start crafting from that point of view, because if you build from that point of view, everything else becomes just more genuine. Everything becomes very organic. There's nothing worse, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people have met people like that, is with meeting someone who's got an amazing online personality. They've got great brand building, great PR, and then you have a conversation with them, and you can see that there's just really no substance. And so the principle of substance over form is something that's driven me a lot, is that I don't ever talk about things I've never experienced. I don't ever put myself out there about experiences I haven't had. I don't ever have a point of view if I'm not very close to that thing. And for me, that's held me accountable. It's made sure that I'm, number one, always able to speak with authority when I do speak, but it's also made sure that I've always been able to know my lane and stay in my lane. And in so doing, I think the brand building, which is what you're speaking about, I think that then comes, kind of naturally and organically. But that starting point around being genuine, I think, is the difference between those that have done it well and those that haven't. And then the mechanics of, the PR, the that kicks in and it complements what you've done. And you would hate to be in a situation where you've not necessarily spent the time crafting that as a starting point, and then the mechanics of the PR kick in, because you're always going to be on the back foot. You're always going to be, it's an uncomfortable place to be. I cannot imagine having to speak about things that you've never lived, or having to speak about stuff you never experienced, or having to make things up to try and kind of keep up the pretense. That would be a horrible place to be. So for me, that was the process, is the self-reflection as a starting point. And then what happens as a result of that is that you build on that as a base for your brand.
So I want to add to that, though, because you've spoken about Nicola Kleyn, and in your book, it wasn't like you didn't build that relationship without reaching out. Yes. Share that story a little bit, because I think sometimes, one of the greatest barriers, I think, to personal branding is that people lack the confidence. Why would he talk to me? Absolutely. Who am I? So I'd love you to share that story, because I think it's an insightful story. And if you look at the effort you put into trampolining that relationship, yes, it's an important part of who you are today.
Yeah, no, it's really, we laugh about it today, but at the time I was I think my second year at WITS. I'd started a business called Monati Fellas. I was doing choreography and dancing. I was doing all sorts of things at the time, and I was also trying to figure out. It was also after I'd failed my first year doing actuarial science, so I was kind of in this like, where am I going mode. And I kind of chose to do a BCom general, and one of the subjects was obviously marketing. And I started to get interested in marketing, but I wanted to understand more the brand valuation side, which I think was my technical brain trying to pull me back in. And so I was trying to find mentors and references and who's done this thing and how does it work. And then one day, just fortunately, we had this guest lecturer who came, to speak to us, and it was Tebe, driving this really fancy black Porsche. And I was sitting at NCB at WITS, which means that I could see the parking lot. And I saw this guy pull in and park in
which is the most soulless building in the entire world. I park in that building, yeah.
As you can imagine. So, I'm seeing this Porsche, and I'm seeing this, and I see this guy come out looking, genuinely like a GQ model. And he walks in and he's black and he looks young and he looks hip. And I'm going, wow. And so fortunately he's coming to lecture us. And so I'm sitting there, and then he starts talking, and at the time he had just come back, and he was the managing director for Nike Africa. And he was the first black guy to be in that position. So I was like, wow, this guy's just a thing. And so obviously, afterwards I went up to him and I said, yo, Tebe, I think this is phenomenal. I've never heard about you. I don't know who you are, but I really would love for us to kind of have a chat. And so obviously he said, yeah, of course we can have a chat. And he handed me his business card, and, off he went. Sent him an email immediately. I didn't get a response. I followed up the following week, no response. I did about 3 or 4 times. Then just by, circumstance, we were actually at the same airport at the same time. So I was traveling to, I think it was Cape Town. So I was at OR Tambo, and he was coming back from Cape Town. And we bumped into each other. And I remember saying, Tebe, I've sent you how many emails and you haven't responded to me? And you could see us being very sheepish. Oh, did you send her the right email type stuff? And I said, of course I sent her the right email. And I said, and then at that moment I realized that there was an imbalance in value, and it's informed my mentorship model now. But the first thing I said to him, Tebe, there's a lot I think I can learn from you as a mentor, but I think there's a hell of a lot I can probably teach you as well. So I think we should have that coffee. And I remember him looking at me, kind of going, who's this young Thundercat telling me he can teach me anything? And that's where the relationship dynamic changed. And from that point, and it was very true, fortunately, because at that time, he wasn't as prolific as he is on social media or Facebook. He had no understanding of technology. He had no understanding of social media, which was pretty much where my headspace was at. So from that point, our relationship was then formed on mutual value exchange. And that's where, my mentorship models are always based on, yes, obviously I'm here to try and help you, but if you can find a reciprocal way to create value, it makes it that much easier to work together. And so Tebe and I have literally been doing that for the last, 7 to 10 years, which is I think is a success story in the bigger scheme of things.
But you got out there and you made the first move, and that's what it's all about. So now you're getting out there with another venture that's not that new. I think it first came onto my radar about 2 years ago. Maybe I missed the start of it, but tell us a little bit about Bridge Labs.
Right. So yeah, Bridge Labs is a software engineering and design thinking business. I started it immediately when I left Facebook. And it was born out of a bit of frustration and inspiration. At Facebook, on any given day, you have 5,000 to 7,000 engineers in one building, just solving things, right?
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing the scale at which that company operated. And when I looked at that and I used to come back to the continent, I could never find that concentration of talent anywhere, let alone it being African talent. So when I started Bridge Labs with my CTO and co-founder, we wanted to create a space for African engineers that could work with marketers to start understanding how to develop new products. And why African engineers? Because we believe proximity to the problem takes away a lot of the guesswork that you need to kind of figure out. And so the last 3.5, 4 years, we've set about on this journey to build a small team. We've got about 17 engineers now. We've built products in different sectors. So our strategy is sector agnostic. So we're not a fintech, we're not an ed tech. We've got a great engineering team. And if we believe in the problem, we solve in that space. And we partner with companies that are either thought leaders in that space with no technology, or feel like they can innovate to be able to create new products with them. So that's effectively what Bridge Labs does.
Exciting, very exciting, and changing that space of the role that we play going forward. So of course, one of the things is it's all very well controlling the trampoline, but this little microscopic virus called COVID has come and bounced us. We are not trampolining, we have been trampolined. And I think particularly now, both for the world, but also South Africa's in a very difficult spot right now. And it doesn't help that it's cold. Spring is on its way, but it really doesn't help that it's cold. I mean, on one hand, we can be overwhelmed. And when I speak to colleagues, there is this sort of sense sometimes of this is just too heavy. What comes through to me very importantly from your book is this question of mindset, is this question of how we frame, is this question of how we think. What's your advice to everybody here today around sense making and how we use this trampolining actually for positive, that we can actually see ourselves moving to a better place?
Yeah. Look, I mean, without being too optimistic, I think the reality is the reality, and it's going to be a very difficult time, and it has been a difficult time for many businesses. I think from a mental perspective, one of the things I did as a knee-jerk reaction is I went, in the first 2 weeks of lockdown, I took out all the journals. I journal, so I keep notes of a lot of things, and I took out all the journals that I could find. And I just kind of read through them. And it was for me a very cathartic process to realize that there have been very specific moments along my journey where it felt like it was like all or nothing, right? This is going to be the end. And I reflect on it and I kind of go, in that moment, I must have felt like I had no other option, but I'm actually here and I'm alive and I'm okay. And having read through that a few times and seen that actually there is a light at the end of the tunnel, gave me kind of that feeling of, okay, you know what, it's bad, but it'll get better. The second thing is there's a reality to being a human being. There's a reason why we've gone on to become the top of the food chain, is that, the human resilience is underrated many, many times. If you think about the book that Yuval Harari wrote called Sapiens, he speaks about why we've become so resilient. He speaks about the fact that we can create common language to be able to exchange ideas and to be able to collaborate. He speaks about the fact that we can create either common enemies or common threats. He speaks about a way that we can come together to be able to kind of build humanity's resilience. And I think COVID-19 is another one of those examples. Now, absolutely, there's going to be people that are left on the side. Absolutely, there's going to be casualties. But by and large, just be reassured that we will definitely survive. And the form and function which we come out on the other side has to be different to the form and function we are now. And if you embrace that and you make peace with it, one of the models I've built is about just the mental resolve. Just make peace. Like you can't keep fighting. Every morning when you wake up, you can't keep going, oh, geez, I can't wait for it to go back to how it used to be. Now, best case scenario, it goes back to 10% of what it used to be. That's great. But the 90% is a new reality. So that aspect of just making peace and almost letting go, they have those ceremonies sometimes where you release the balloons. Just do that. Let the balloons go, burn the boats, and start going in a different direction. Now, that muscle is not natural to organizations. That muscle is sometimes unnatural to people, but it's how we are going to survive. So for small businesses that are going through tough times, yes, we've got all the language around pivoting and all that, but as an entrepreneur and as a leader, just put one step in front of the other, because there's a lot of people that are looking to you to not show up as flustered, to not show up as, not having a way to work through things. Be honest with where you're at. Try and at least wear your heart on your sleeve, which I know doesn't come naturally for a lot of leaders, but saying that you don't know is also okay, which I've had to do many times, but we still wake up and we still do the same thing. So I think maintain a level head. In the background, I think it is important to be onboarding information, read a lot, get a lot more insight, connect with people. I know we can do it, virtually. That aspect, that engine room has to keep running. But I think how you present yourself is not as a person that's flustered. And hopefully, as I said, you can make sure that either you pivot now or you figure out how to get efficiencies to make your business work better. But we will get through it, and not without some scars, but we will definitely get through it.
Well, I think if anybody's showcasing the attitude, it's you. And Musa, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to spend some time with you this morning. We've had a couple of comments, people saying that they've valued it. Milton, Armin reaching out. So thank you for joining us today, taking some time. It's lovely, as always, to host one of our alums back here. We watch what you do with great passion and pride. And we will be seeing you on the road as we all move forward, and prosperity is there. It's just ours to discover. So thank you also to the audience for joining us, and Musa, go well and prosper and stay warm.
Thanks, Nicola. Lovely to chat to you, and all of you take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Cheers.